Welcome. I declare open this hearing of the Select Committee on Energy Planning and Regulation in Australia. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land in which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. These proceedings, being video streamed live via Parliament's website and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as contempt. Witnesses before parliamentary committees cannot be sued or prosecuted for giving evidence or for the content of the evidence they give. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a Senate committee. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer or not, having regard to the ground on which the claim is made. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. I now welcome representatives from Energy Networks Australia and the Australian Energy Council. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and protection of witnesses has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
I'm Dominic Vandenberg, Chief Executive of Energy Networks Australia, and I'm joined here by Dominic Adams, General Manager for Networks.
Thank you. Gentlemen, online.
I'm David Feeney. I'm the General Manager of Wholesale and Environment for the Australian Energy Council.
And I'm Ben Barnes. I'm the General Manager of Corporate Affairs at the Australian Energy Council.
Mr Barnes, you're very faint, coming through very faint. I don't know whether you can move a microphone closer or anything, but just letting you know you're quite faint. Would anyone like to make an opening statement? Ms Vandenberg.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present to the inquiry today. Energy Networks Australia is the national industry body representing Australia's electricity transmission and distribution and gas distribution networks. Our members provide more than 16 million electricity and gas connections to almost every home and business across Australia. We made a submission to the inquiry, so I won't take long now, but I would like to take this opportunity to highlight a few key elements. Our members are focused on driving a sustainable energy future for all Australians. As shown in the AER's recent network performance report, in 2023, after adjusting for inflation, electricity consumers on average paid the lowest cost for electricity network services since this reporting started. The report also found that gas network costs were the lowest since the series began in 2011, both in real and nominal terms. And at the same time, we're seeing near all-time highs of reliability performance. As highlighted in our submission, there are strengths of our current framework that make Australia an attractive place for long-term investment, and Australia needs to attract during the energy transition. The strong institutional and governance arrangements in the energy market also directly support the long-term interests of consumers in ensuring efficient levels of investment. The Integrated System Plan is an important point of reference for the industry in describing the lowest cost pathway to deliver against a set of government policy objectives and ensuring that the system is reliable and secure. And Australia's national energy framework has evolved over time and will need to continue to flexibly evolve to deliver outcomes for consumers through the energy transition. Together with large-scale generation and transmission, ENA's The Time Is Now report identifies opportunities within the distribution grid that can be unlocked to help achieve national climate targets and deliver benefits to customers, making better use of what we have. Examples of this include options for promoting faster and wider delivery of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, getting more generation connected to the distribution grid, and soaking up that with more distribution-connected batteries. Importantly, these benefits can be unlocked now by a targeted, pragmatic set of actions available to policymakers and regulators under our framework. In addition, ENA's Renewable Gas for a Future Made in Australia report also highlights key opportunities for policymakers to support a decarbonisation pathway for our nation's heavy industry which will be key in achieving the nation's decarbonisation goals. Thank you again for the opportunity to present, and I welcome your questions.
Australian Energy Council, do you have an opening statement?
Yes, Chair, thank you very much. So the AEC is pleased to appear and give evidence to the Select Committee inquiring into energy planning and regulation. The AEC is the peak industry body for electricity and downstream natural gas businesses operating in the competitive wholesale and retail energy markets. AEC members generate and sell energy to over 10 million homes and businesses and are major investors in renewable energy generation. The AEC supports reaching net zero by 2050, as well as a 55% emissions reduction target by 2035, and is committed to delivering the energy transition for the benefit of consumers. In our submission, we highlighted the critical importance of maintaining a clear governance structure that separates the roles of the AEMC, the AER, and AEMO. Previous reviews, such as the Vertican review, have underscored the need for this separation to promote effective governance and investor confidence. We note that there's been a shift from energy policy being driven largely by market bodies to a situation where governments at both state and Commonwealth level are taking a more hands-on approach. Governments have created new institutions to give effect to this hands-on approach. While we understand the policy rationale, we do note that this could complicate roles and responsibilities. We support a timely review into the national electricity market's future market design to ensure clarity and certainty for investors. If the review was to be conducted by an institution like the Productivity Commission, we think it's important to coordinate the review with existing market bodies and jurisdictions. Lastly, we noted that streamlined regulatory processes, including post-implementation reviews, are important to evaluate the impact of major reforms. Finally, we called for AEMO to incorporate a baseline scenario in its integrated system plan. This transparency is vital for managing the energy transition effectively and ensuring it benefits all consumers. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Canavan, would you like to go first?
Cheers. Well, I might start where you just finished there, Mr. Feeney. I am interested in your idea of AEMO being required to model what you called a baseline. Just take me through what you would expect that to include then.
Thanks, Senator. So what I meant by that was, and I think there's been a lot of evidence given by AEMO and a range of the different market bodies, is currently the integrated system plan really models what it would take for the to find an optimal development path to support the emissions reductions at different levels of government. We think that it would be a more valuable document if it also included whether it's a different scenario or whether it's a range of sensitivities that take into account what we're learning as we progress with this energy transition. So things like supply chain constraints, things like social licence challenges for things like wind farms could alter the trajectory that the transition goes on. And we think there's value from a market participant's perspective in having that as a scenario that gets modelled, as well as scenarios that are consistent with hitting emissions targets.
I suppose the question, though, here is, currently, as I understand it, they do their modelling based on government policies, so that includes 82% renewable energy target, net zero emissions, etc. I'm just trying to work out, are you suggesting the baseline should have none of that, that it should just be purely sort of market-driven, if you like? Or if not, what policies should it have and what should it have? I'm just struggling to understand that.
I think what would be useful would be to have a most likely case of how that trajectory looks, and to the extent there's a delta between what would need to happen for that emissions reductions to come through and the trajectory that it looks like the energy system's on. I think that gives an opportunity for policymakers to help narrow that gap. So you'd still be aiming for the 82% reduction, but something that's more grounded in what's happening out there in the market, I think would help have a more informed debate about energy policy.
I suppose the political problem with that is, in effect, you're asking AEMO to rate the performance of their ministers in achieving their policy goals. So, for example, if AEMO said, oh, look, we don't think 82% renewables will be built by 2030, it'll just be 50%, 60%. Of course, the headline in every paper in the country will be energy expert says government falling 50% short. So anyway, I don't think I'll ever be going back to the ministerial leather, but I can't believe any minister agreeing to such a process. Wouldn't it be more logical just to say, what if we just ran a baseline with no policies at all? No policy interventions, if you like, and then we can compare the two. That way they're not trying to mark, you're not asking AEMO to put in a very difficult position of marking the government's homework, so to speak.
Yeah, that would be an alternative approach, and I guess in the end it's a matter for policymakers, and the sense I have is that AEMO feels somewhat constrained by the national electricity rules in terms of how it can do the ISP, so it's open to policymakers to change that.
I mean, you'd make that point in your submission. Your submission, I think, says that you don't think they are constrained by the rules from doing this. Is that right?
That's our interpretation of it. We think it would, that version of a baseline that's more grounded in what's going on feels just like the usual kind of sensitivity analysis that you would do and generate kind of what-if scenarios. If this doesn't happen, then what do you do next? It just seems like a pretty good risk mitigation strategy to us.
Ms Vandenberg or Mr Adams, do you have anything to add on this particular issue about the ISP and how it is conducted?
I think overall we'd agree that what's included in the ISP is a matter for policymakers as to what they feel would be a helpful input for them to make the calls that they need to make if they intend to use the ISP as an input into their policy decision making. Then it's a call for them to set that direction for AEMO as to what's included within it.
Okay. Just going back then to the Energy Council and another issue in your submission you raise, do you support a capacity mechanism? Yeah, just a capacity mechanism.
So, just to be clear, are you talking about the capacity incentives?
No, I'm
okay.
talking about the previous proposals. I don't know the exact status of them, but the proposals to establish some kind of market for capacity that I believe the ESB back in the day might have been recommending or working up, but seems to have fallen on the wayside now. So what's the Energy Council's position on that?
Look, I think to be clear, there's probably a range of views within our members. We do observe that as the penetration of variable renewable energy increases, an energy-only market in terms of signalling for investment to come forward can be challenged relative to a capacity market. On the other hand, an energy market is incredibly well designed to signal operational timeframe decisions and make sure the right mix of energy shows up when it's most needed. So another thing we did say in our submission is we understand there's a potential market settings review that the Productivity Commission may or may not conduct, and we're keen to see that process kick off because we think that would be a really instructive process. And as we understand it, the CIS induces some of the VRE to come on between now and 2030, but you do need those market settings to be known well ahead of time so that investment can flow more based on market settings and less based on government intervention.
I mean, your submission says there's meant to be, I think, a review of the national energy market, the future market design of the national energy market, and apparently that in March, ministers agreed that they would finalise this review, including the final design of any capacity mechanism, by no later than the end of 2025. But your submission also says that the terms of reference for that has not yet been released. Is that still the case? We haven't even got a terms of reference for it yet?
That's certainly my understanding. We're hearing that it's not too far away, but we're no clearer than any other participant.
How long is the review expected to take? Have they mapped that out?
I think what's happened is the terms of reference has taken time to come out, but at this point in time, the end date hasn't shifted. And so, one of the things that worries us is if you compress the time frame of the review, it'll be less instructive than it could otherwise be.
For sure. Moving on again, you also talk about some of the changed responsibilities of the different market bodies and how there's potentially I don't know if you used the word confusion, but that's what I took away from your submission. There's a little bit of mudding here. I suppose I particularly wanted to drill down to this issue of AEMO services. It's something that just jumped out at me when I read your submission, that apparently AEMO services will have some role in running the tenders for the capacity investment scheme. Then, of course, AEMO itself also designs this ISP, which seems to have become quite definitive in terms of planning for the energy market. So to me, it just raises the issue of, is there a potential conflict here between one element of AEMO actually making effectively investments or deciding on investments on particular technologies, and it will be judged on the performance of those investments one way or another, and then also then actually designing the system, which will probably have a significant impact on whether those investments work or not?
Yeah, look, I don't know whether I characterise it as a conflict. You could make an argument that doing the upfront planning and setting out, what sorts of technologies you need, more of and less of, gives you a good springboard into making the tender decisions. But it is fair to say that AEMO's, scope of responsibilities, broadens year on year, and it is a new set of activities. And my understanding is AEMO services was set up as part of the New South Wales roadmap initially to administer the LTESs for New South Wales, and that role has kind of morphed to running CIS tenders on behalf of the Commonwealth, largely because they developed that expertise in the New South Wales context. So I guess it's kind of an example of, in the energy system, there's been a history over the last few years of one intervention begetting a further intervention, and it feels a bit piecemeal at times. And that's why I'd circle back to, the NEM 2030 review, I think has a lot of merit in having a fresh look at things.
Yeah, just bouncing from one crisis to the next, basically. I suppose I'm happy to give, before I move on to energy networks, is there anything you wanted to add on that issue? You don't have to, it wasn't from your submission. But turning to your submission, and I think in your opening comments, you said that the cost of electricity network services is the lowest since 2011. Is that in absolute terms or as a share of the bill?
Absolute terms. Say again. It's a share. You mentioned it's the lowest cost for electricity network services. Is that in the actual cents or dollars terms, or is it as a share of an electricity bill? No, that's adjusting for inflation cost.
Just what, sorry?
Adjusting for inflation, that's cost.
Just the total cost in maybe you could give me the numbers. Have you got the numbers in front of you? What's the cost today?
I don't have those numbers in front of you.
Okay, you have to take that on notice for what it was. Presumably this is the lowest since 2011, isn't it? I was a bit confused.
I think the numbers are coming from the AER's Network Performance Report, which looks at the cost of delivering services over time.
Okay.
And the observation from that is that the incentive framework that underpins and sets the revenues for networks and provides incentives for networks to outperform is a framework that is delivering and driving greater performance for lower cost over time, and that's the kind of observation or takeaway there.
Okay, well maybe if you could take on notice, because your submission says the report also found gas network costs were the lowest since 2011, but I just wasn't sure if that time frame was relevant for the electricity point as well, the sentence that preceded it. So maybe you could take on notice over what time period is that your point in your submission relevant, so it's the lowest cost over what time frame, and also what the actual numbers were at its previous peak and a previous low, and its low now. All right, well, I might leave it there for time, Chair. I've got more questions if there is time.
If there's time, I'll come back to you.
Thank you.
Senator Gosh.
Thank you very much. If I could ask firstly to Energy Networks Australia, one of the debates that has emerged in this committee in the last couple of hearings has been a debate on the balance to be struck between distribution opportunities and whether consumer energy resources can be realised instead of building large-scale transmission projects. Could you offer your view on that debate and whether you believe that to be the case, or whether these are alternatives, or whether in essence we just need to be investing in all of these different options.
Thanks for the question, Senator. We firmly believe that this is not an either-or situation, and that to achieve net zero we need transmission. We did publish this report, which is I think what you're referring to, The Time Is Now, and this shows that the distribution network can do more of the heavy lifting now to achieve the targets on time and, importantly, deliver benefits to customers. These benefits delivered by the distribution networks do not mean that any of the large-scale transmission projects are no longer needed or that should be meaningfully delayed. The modelling that was done largely brings forward actions on the distribution grid that have been assumed for the next few decades, which then relieves some timing pressure on the large scale and brings benefits to customers now. So what this report said is that there are benefits to taking these actions on our distribution grid, irrespective of large-scale timing. And one of the largest drivers of consumer benefits comes from accelerating EV adoption. This has real impact on driving down customers' total costs. And we can also get more generation connected to the distribution grid and soak it up with more distribution-connected storage. The key point of this, though, and why we kicked off doing this report, is that these actions are achievable now with the assets and the resources that we have today. And importantly, all customers benefit, regardless of whether those customers have a solar, a battery, an EV. There are levers available to policymakers and regulators under our existing framework that can deliver benefits to all customers.
What do you see as the potential risks in terms of reliability and prices if there's a failure to invest in transmission infrastructure or an underinvestment in that infrastructure?
I think that's possibly a good question for Nexa Advisory, who did a great report on this a number of years ago, looking at the ISP and what the impacts for customers are if ISP projects are delayed, so kind of monetising and costing out what those impacts are. I don't have available to me the exact numbers and so on, but it's quite large numbers for each year or 6 months that the transmission optimal development path is delayed. The costs for customers increase.
But to your question then on why do we need transmission, really, we see this through the lens of coal-fired power stations are closing, and they're closing because they're ageing and they're becoming less reliable, and we are, as a society, committed to net zero, and removing coal from the electricity system is one of the lowest cost ways to get there. And added to this, we're expecting the electricity grid to increase significantly, to more than double. And so this necessarily means building new transmission infrastructure to connect energy from where it's produced in the future to the solar and wind-rich regions into our cities and into our regions.
Thank you. If I could ask now the Australian Energy Council, your submission noted that our energy market governance structure and the responsibility of independent market bodies for different aspects of the system was a best practice model. Are you able to elaborate on that and perhaps also give your views on your confidence in the ISP as reflective of independent expertise and a document that you have confidence in generally?
Sure. So in relation to best practice governance, I'd direct you to the Vertican review. It was a while ago, but it's really quite instructive. And what Vertican found a few different things, but the first was that the 3 different market bodies were set up with different roles and with distinct responsibilities. And there's an element of almost creative tension built into that governance, which kind of represents best practice. There was a period of time after the Finkel review where the Energy Security Board was established to, I guess, drive more of a consensus decision-making approach. The problem with that approach, and I think the high point of the ESB was when they were trying to usher in the NEG, But the problem with the ESB was that it kind of put all of the market bodies on the same level rather than having the rule maker, the AMC, as the prime market body of the three. And I think a return to those more distinct roles is likely to lead to better outcomes than we've seen. I think there has been a bit of confusion amongst the market bodies about who does what, who has a policy making role, who operates the market. So I just pause there. In relation to the ISP, I think AEMO is very much doing what it's been told to do in terms of generating that optimal development path consistent with the emissions reductions policies of government. I do note in some of the questioning some frustration or perhaps some confusion about what is the purpose of the ISP, and it can be different things to different people. And I think it's apparent that at times AEMO is essentially doing a modelling exercise of what would need to happen, but it can be received by stakeholders as something that will definitely happen, and that's where some confusion could kick in. So some submissions we've made to AEMO in the ISPs, they could more carefully communicate what the ISP is and what it isn't. And as I was saying to Senator Canavan, the other thing we'd like to see is that kind of baseline scenario of what are we on track to achieving, and to the extent that's something lower than 82% by 2030, what are some decisions that policymakers might be able to make to help bridge that gap?
One of the suggestions that emerged from testimony yesterday was that the removal of legal prohibitions on the nuclear industry in Australia would offer a benefit to the Australian energy system. Can I just ask, from the Australian Energy Council's point of view, is there industry interest in developing and investing in nuclear power in Australia?
Look, from our perspective, we deal, and our members deal with what's kind of currently on the table. So to the extent the framework is there's a moratorium on nuclear power, I think some of our CEOs have kind of on the record as saying if they're actively exploring, rolling out nuclear power, then they're kind of not focusing on their day job. So if policymakers were to, change that approach at some point in the future, I think they'd, be interested in exploring it. I think generally speaking, killing off options and taking off options off the table in an environment where there's uncertainty over the next 10 or 20 years isn't advisable. But our perspective is very much a technology neutral perspective.
And so does that...
One more.
Thanks, Chair. And so do I understand your answer as essentially being one that all options ought to be explored? If you could confirm that and then give me your view or the Australian Energy Council's view on if, for instance, tomorrow prohibitions on nuclear power were removed, would that obviate the need to continue to invest in renewables, storage, transition, or is it an all of the above approach?
So if it was lifted tomorrow, I don't think it would obviate the need to invest in renewables, both from a timing perspective, and it's also worth making the point that you want a mixture of different generation types. They've got different economic characteristics, different technical characteristics, and this idea that you should just have one or two generation types, I think, introduces more risk into the system than is required.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Just going to the ISP, and your submission talks about the draft rule that it might facilitate consideration of distribution networks within the ISP. But at the moment, I'm correct, aren't I, in saying that the ISP really just looks at transmission networks in its planning?
So I think it looks at both, but in different ways. So the ISP treats what happens on the distribution system essentially as an input into its modelling process. So it needs to work out what is the optimal development path or the set of investments that would best deliver government policy objectives over the long term, out to sort of that decarbonisation journey to 2050. But what the output is a plan at the transmission level, and it needs to take into account a whole range of different inputs, including what sort of loads are expected, but also what sort of generation types are sitting within the distribution system. And a lot of detailed modelling and inputs and assumptions work. About a year of the process is working out what are those inputs and how do you frame those up in a way that that stakeholders kind of agree with.
But Tim, you then just, I think, agreed with me that the ISP, its only outputs are transmission projects. It doesn't, for example, while it might take into account the distribution network, it doesn't take a view on how it could be improved and add more economic value to either the NEM or the transition.
We do agree that the ISP needs to continue to evolve, and it should evolve as it has evolved over the last few years.
Yeah. And
so the recent AEMC proposed rule changes on better integrating gas, absolutely, and better integrating consumer energy resources, and through conversations with AEMO on distribution networks, continuing to evolve to better look at distribution networks too. And so to move from it being a static input to a more dynamic input would be a good thing to do.
And we've got our first ISP 2018. We've now got the 2024 working on the 2026. And we'd be lucky if there's any outputs towards anything other than transmission, the 2026. Given the incredibly good report that ENA put out, the Time Is Now report, where you highlight some of the benefits that could be brought to the energy market that are not, just network based. A fantastic piece of work, and something I've been calling for a long time. It shows a real vision around what our national electricity market could and should look like. Whereas at the moment, it looks like AEMO looks like a hammer and every problem is a nail, and that nail is transmission. Surely we have to very quickly move beyond this approach and start to look at more unique ways that we can add real economic value to the national electricity market.
We do. One of the things, like I said in my opening statement, is that we do see the time is now actions that can be taken relatively quickly within the policy framework, within the governance framework that needs to happen. And so I have heard, I've heard Daniel Westman talk about battery storage, about CER. I think there is a strong desire to get more of that in the system. I think there's a difference though between what the ISP is set out to do, what David kind of outlined in his testimony there, as to what it does do and what it doesn't do, and accepting it for that and hoping it evolves. But a lot of these recommendations that are in the Time Is Now can be done through policy change, through the regulatory framework that we've got to actually get on that in a relatively quick space of time. So we don't see it as to do the set of recommendations that are here, you need to throw everything out. We think you can work within it and you can get them done.
And I agree. I think those things should be done and should be done now and probably years ago. But my point is they make real economic sense moving forward. And the ISP does make an economic benefit case for more transmission. Now, I'm not arguing that more transmission is needed, but if you're planning an energy system, particularly an integrated energy system, as the ISP is called, then you need to be looking beyond just one aspect of that, which is the transmission aspect.
Yeah, I tend to agree that the question for AEMO is probably also one of just modelling and compute capability. It is pretty difficult to have a fully co-optimised distribution set of inputs as well as a fully co-optimised transmission set of outputs as well. So as a task, I think an exercise that could produce that perfect outcome where you know exactly what to do on the transmission system and exactly what to do on the distribution system as an output of that report might be asking a bit too much of it. But the question is, can we better take into account and get a better understanding of what different occurrences on the distribution scale might be able to do and what that means for the optimal development path on the transmission scale. And a lot of that is happening in the rule changes that that Dom mentioned just a moment ago, in that AEMO is being asked to better take into account and integrate the gas and the interactions with the gas system, as well as better take into account the distribution system and the range of possible outcomes that could occur on the distribution system.
Sure, and the report focuses and highlights bring in more EVs. Lots of things that are adding real value and economic value. And I would assume, although it's not been modelled by anyone, particularly AEMO, what other projects does that displace? By having more rooftop solar, do you displace the need for line augmentation somewhere, or with batteries, either co-located with generation or at either end of the transmission or distribution lines? How do you strengthen the system? And the ISP takes, it has one single counterfactual, that's all or nothing transmission. It doesn't even differentiate between connecting reses, for example, and interstate interconnectors. There's, to Mr. Feeney's point, there's probably a number of baselines that it wouldn't be difficult for AEMO to model, other than one they do, and that seems simply because they want one particular outcome.
We can probably only comment to the extent that this was tested within the modelling that underpinned our Time Is Now report. Yeah. And what that did was to take the inputs for the ISP and add more solar and more batteries within the distribution system. And what the outcome at the transmission system was, though, that you still see a need for those transmission projects. The renewable energy zones are still getting filled up. So it may take a tiny bit of timing pressure off some of those investments, but not really on the modelling. You still need those to come through at pace.
Thank you, and lots more questions on that I'd love to put, and I might put them on notice. I just want to touch, your members are also gas distribution networks. With the move to electrification and moving away from gas, how does your industry and you as a peak body, how are we going to view, or what thoughts do you have on how we make that a just transition if we have to make it? Yeah,
so when we say gas, I think it's important to put gas into context. 70% of gas is for industry, heavy manufacturing, 10% of gas is in the home. And so where customers on any side of that spectrum can electrify, they should electrify. Yep. But there is also an incredible role that gas currently plays in Australia and will continue to play, and I think that's becoming increasingly clear, that does underpin the economy and that we need a decarbonisation pathway for that. The recent future gas strategy went some way to address that, but there are more that needs to be done to make sure that heavy industry, in particular high heat feedstock, has a decarbonisation pathway. And we put out a report, Renewable Gas Pathway for Australia, that sets out a kind of optimised way of getting there. But it's going to need renewable gas, and it's going to need policy that underpins to make that happen. Otherwise, we're going to see those jobs go offshore, and we're going to see manufacturing go offshore.
100% agree. I'm more asking, is the industry working with government? Because obviously, once the gas distribution networks are stranded, or you hit a point where there's, customers are paying more and more because there's less customers on the network and the charges stay the same. It sounds like a bit of an economic black hole that's coming towards us. I'm just concerned whether that's being managed properly.
So when it comes to gas distribution, it is important to notice that isn't just gas in the home. A lot of industry is still connected to gas distribution networks. Now, that said, there are high levels of uncertainty around the pathway and the pace of the overall energy transition, and the potential for the economic life of the overall network to be shorter than previously considered. And so networks are proposing adjustments to depreciation and following engagement with customer representatives and a consideration of a range of scenarios. So this is not the entire solution to this uncertainty, but adjusting for depreciation provides one way to recognise potential asset stranding risk, and it also supports intergenerational equity, to your point, by allowing more recovery of the network asset capital base where there are more customers on that network.
No view that if it's a government-driven decision that it should be put on or transferred to the government balance sheet rather than to energy users?
There are no easy answers to this question, and I think the continuing engagement between the regulator and the different market bodies and customers and the industry is something that will need to continue over the next few years.
But this is largely just a Victorian problem, isn't it? So
not necessarily.
No? But Victoria has the largest gas distribution network, and it's only the Victorian government, as far as I'm aware, that's pushing to turn off gas to Victorian homes.
So Victoria has 70% of the domestic gas demand into homes, so it absolutely is topical there. And we continue to work with that Victorian government on this issue.
Terrific. I look forward to hearing more about that moving forward. Thank you for appearing today. Where am I? And thank you for your evidence. The committee has set Wednesday, 13 November, as the due date for questions taken on notice. I'm not sure that there were any, but you will most likely receive some written ones from me.
We have got one from Senator Canavan. We've got that one. Thank you.
Terrific.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you for appearing. And next is Nexa Advisory, please.
That's great.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for appearing at the Energy Planning and Regulation Australia. I think I welcome Ms. Stephanie Bashir, Chief Executive Officer of Nexa Advisory. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate inquiries has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Yes. Good afternoon. It's Stephanie Bashir, CEO of Nexa Advisory.
Thank you. Ms. Bashir, would you like to make a short opening statement?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So Nexa Advisory welcomes the opportunity to appear before the Select Committee on the Energy Planning and Regulation in Australia to discuss this important issue. Nexa is a for-purpose advisory firm. Our unwavering focus is accelerating the clean energy transition in a way that provides secure, reliable and affordable power for consumers of all types. As technical as it might seem, there is a straight line from the issues of planning and regulation to the electricity bills that Australian families and businesses pay. Debate about how to deliver best practice governance of the energy market has been ongoing for many years, including several reviews initiated by the former Council of Australian Governments, COAG Energy Council. There is a broad agreement that Australia's energy market governance is not fit for purpose. That means Australians are bearing unnecessary cost of delays to the energy transition. The reviews have consistently highlighted issues which have not been adequately addressed. These include the need for energy ministers to have a clear role in providing policy and strategic direction, the lack of clarity about the role of market bodies and the potential for that to lead to conflicts of interest, and the poor engagement with stakeholders and lack of transparency. Next advisory's submission to the committee sets out the issues in detail and offers 6 detailed recommendations. I would summarise those here into 3 key asks. Australia needs a strategic energy plan with bipartisan support. It must set the roles and priorities for the market bodies and regulators, including their governance and engagement. The federal government must commission an independent review of the boards of the AER, the AEMC, AEMO, Energy Consumers Australia, to ensure alignment with the strategy, clarity of roles, and to ensure that they have the right mix of skills and knowledge and are appropriately independent. The federal government must also commission an independent review of the electricity networks. In particular, it's important that the review assess whether ring-fencing rules, which are in place to protect Australian taxpayers and energy consumers, are being appropriately applied in spirit and in law. Current market structures and governance arrangements are not keeping pace with developments across the world in new energy, new business models, changing consumer preferences, and decarbonisation. And if this is not addressed, we will have little success in managing the risks and embracing the opportunities of a more dynamic power system, let alone meeting our climate targets. There is a clear need to provide greater strategic leadership, policy coherence, and coordination for the energy sector. This would increase customer engagement and social licence, and most importantly, investment certainty. That would support the development of critical transmission infrastructure, the build-out of renewable energy to replace our fleet of ageing, unreliable and expensive coal power generators. It would get the clean energy transition done, and it would provide secure, reliable and affordable energy for all consumers who are also taxpayers and voters, and meet our commitments to international agreements on emissions. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Senator Canavan.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much. Just want to ask, trying to get to the bottom of this, and you might not be able to help, but just particularly with these consumer, is it CEO, is it Consumer Energy Resources?
Consumer Energy Resources is what's being, the term used in the energy industry, yes.
I get confused with all the acronyms in this space. How are they dealt with at the moment, the ISP? I think we sort of learned from last week and yesterday that it would appear that AEMO don't cost the acquisition of, say, batteries, I don't know about rooftop solar, that sort of stuff in their modelling. Do you know how that works in the ISP?
So I guess the ISP, obviously, I'll leave that question for AEMO to answer in detail, but from my perspective, the ISP currently provides a forward forecast on what are the types of investments that basically are required to close down the coal power stations based on the dates that they are provided from the coal owners. Obviously, there are a couple of scenarios. The step change scenario, which has been, if you like, chosen as the pathway. Obviously, the step change is not a 1.5 degree scenario, it's a 1.8 scenario, and that really is a very conservative scenario to look at what sort of investments are needed in their terms at lowest cost to deliver the transition and drive the investment needed in order to have the right replacement generation ahead of the coal closures.
Just to be clear, I know this is a really complex area, so I'm not trying to be cute, but to be clear, what AEMO said last week is that the coal closures in their model is driven by the carbon budgets primarily, not the closure dates. Their closure dates in their ISP are often sooner than what has been publicly announced. On FOI, the Freedom of Information Request, AEMO revealed that their battery forecasts in the ISP require a 50% CapEx subsidy from this year. Now, I don't believe, you might be able to correct me, but I don't believe we have such a policy in place in Australia. But what do you think is needed? Do you think we need to get these forecasts to be paying for half the costs of the installation of a battery at people's homes?
Yeah, so at the moment, the ISP is forecasting that we need 22 gigawatts of energy storage. So it's not just batteries,
right,
but more broadly, by 2030, and roughly 49 by 2050. We currently have 3 gigawatts in the system connected. Of course, there's a lot of projects in the pipeline, but to get from 3 gigawatts to the assumed forecast of 22 gigawatts, that's a huge investment that's going to be required. This is where basically the capacity investment scheme that was announced by the federal government plays a really significant role, especially dedicated auctions that would support energy storage projects. And at the same time, the New South Wales long-term service agreements, the LTESA scheme, which was designed really to encourage and incentivise energy storage projects. In my view, these things are not happening fast enough still, even with the auctions that are available. We did some research earlier in the year in partnership with the Clean Energy Investor Group on the financeability of energy storage in Australia, where we outlined some of the key issues around energy storage and what are some of the key policies required to really expedite investment in energy storage.
Okay, I'm still just come back to this issue of should we subsidise it. I suppose I'm a bit mindful that we learnt last week that we're now introducing what I've called a sun tax. So from next year in Sydney, if you're an Ausgrid, you have to pay. Yeah. You'll have to pay to export your solar power to the grid, and seemingly this is a result of the over-subsidisation of solar energy, and we now have too much of it, and we've got to tax it, even though apparently the sun was free. So I just wonder, I mean, if we go down this path of sort of getting people to install batteries as much as they can, possibly AEMO seems to suggest subsidising it to a significant degree, aren't we just creating more problems when we try and we push here in the energy network and tilt it towards this technology? Then we have these other problems down the track like we have now by having to introduce a sun tax. How do we avoid that?
Energy storage is actually quite a big solution to a lot of the problems that we've currently got. You hear, there's minimum demand issues on the network because of the increased uptake of solar. Batteries actually can resolve that, especially home batteries. You hear that, there's electricity prices and people are really struggling paying their bills. Solar and batteries solves that directly. And all the system issues that we hear from the market operator around, the variable renewables and the uptake of solar, and consistently, energy storage really is a firming technology that, if expedited, can resolve a lot of the issues that we've got right now. And so as we are phasing out our current coal power stations that have served us well for decades, we actually need to do very similar investments as a country in the replacement technologies. And right now, energy storage is a really big benefit for us. So
I'm not disputing any of that. I suppose the issue is at what cost? And at least as far as I've heard so far in this inquiry, we're not really getting a good measure of the cost of installing consumer energy resources through the ISP, or nothing else that I've seen. So no doubt that possibly installing batteries might help this issue of excess solar, might reduce peaks in the evening, etc. But someone should be still doing the running the rule over this and deciding, well, is this worth it? And so do you know of anyone who's done that, or do you have any, you're obviously an advocate for this option, where's the cost-benefit analysis showing this is worth it?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of different cost-benefit analysis over the years, and it's important to separate consumer energy resources and batteries in the home versus utility scale batteries, and that topic really does need to be separated. Consumer energy resources, people are investing in that, even with some subsidies with solar and that, you know, Australians are investing in those technologies to put them in their home so that they can reduce their bills. On the utility scale side, one of the key issues, I guess, which is why it requires still the right incentives and governments to have the right policies, is there is a lack of certainty on when the coal power stations will close to allow for investors to understand when the revenue streams for these investments can actually take place. That has a lot of impact on the financeability and financial closures of these projects.
How much does a battery cost at a household level?
Up to $15,000.
$15,000?
That's a rough estimate.
Right.
There's a lot cheaper
I'm just
batteries as well.
wondering, how do you get a payback on that then? I mean, let's just run some rough cost benefit now. I've just brought up the average bill in Ausgrid, the network I was mentioning. The average residential bill is around $1,800 a year at the moment. $15,000. I mean, I presume, unless the battery can get your bill down to zero, which is probably unlikely, and obviously you need to install solar and other things to power the battery, that's not going to be paid back in even 7 years. So how is it, I'm just coming back to this point, how is that maths, like, it seems like even AEMO need to force a 50% subsidy to get that down to 7,500 to get people to take it up. I'm just looking for the quantitative data here for why this is a good idea.
Even without really direct subsidies here in Australia, Australians are still buying behind-the-meter batteries. We've had over 400,000 batteries installed over the last decade, and there's just in this year alone, 147,000 batteries have been installed. I guess you can look at just the cost, pure cost, but you can also look at it from a broader perspective. What are some of the things that we can do to help actually incentivize these batteries? For example, tariff reform. We've talked about network tariff reform for decades. We still don't have the right tariffs that incentivize these types of purchases. And just like, you know, we had solar, you know, a decade ago, solar technology was very expensive, but with the right incentives, the tariffs, and the demand for that, and the competition, you know, Australia leads the way in rooftop solar, and we really should be looking at how can we actually replicate a similar model for behind-the-meter batteries.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Gosh.
Thank you. May we stay on that topic, because I was interested in your submission that opportunities to manage some of the issues by incentivising consumer behaviour have been neglected. I notice you've been talking about some of those incentives with Senator Canavan. Are there any others that you'd like to mention or elaborate on in terms of encouraging desirable consumer behaviour?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We actually did quite a number of analysis into the consumer energy or distributed energy resources, and we found that there are some really low-hanging fruit that can actually, if taken action into now, we can accelerate the take-up and mitigate a lot of the issues that get talked about in the industry. For example, we hear a lot that rooftop solar is causing minimum demand issues on the system, right? However, we are also hearing that the networks the distribution electricity networks are underutilised, and we've seen that from the Energy Networks Australia report and also some of the reports that have been released by the AER. The key thing around consumer energy is it reduces bills directly. So what do we actually need to do? It does solve the problem of a lot of the issues that people are talking about, especially when we're talking about coupled with a battery or a battery on wheels, which are the electric vehicles. The uptake of electric vehicles does solve the minimum demand issue with charging at the right times. But right now, from a low-hanging fruit perspective, there's no visibility at the low voltage level on the network in a public kind of reporting way where these capacity issues are, and if the network was to augment these capacity issues, how much it would cost. Those signals are a very important signal to be able to attract non-network solutions, whether they're bigger batteries on the network or behind-the-meter batteries that would present a business case for providers and aggregators to deliver these types of options and solutions. So publicly available data on network capacity and constraints with the cost is really, really important. The other low-hanging fruit, as I mentioned, is tariffs. We keep talking about tariffs, but we are yet to see a proper review on how do we actually get tariffs that are up to date and consistent with where we are as an industry in the energy transition that we're in. We continue to introduce mechanisms and tariffs that penalise consumers who are trying to do the right thing, like the export tariff that Senator Canavan mentioned. But we also see that AEMO, working with the states, they've introduced the backstop mechanism, and they're saying that will only be used in an emergency state. But we haven't really seen yet what is going to be the steps ahead of that before it gets to an emergency. There are solutions that can be applied, and I think energy storage does play a big part in that.
One of the other aspects of your submission was related to Energy Consumers Australia, and you observed that they'd focused on advocacy for traditional energy customers, including vulnerable hardship customers and lower socioeconomic customers, and I think that's very understandable, but perhaps there was less focus on new energy consumers. In terms of resolving that issue, is that a function of having a separate advocacy body, or is that simply a function of having Energy Consumers Australia widen its remit?
It is a gap at the moment, and it's been a gap for many years. It's the new energy consumer, which is more and more a key part of the energy market, and they are driving the transition. I think, either reviewing the board of the ECA and its remit, or having a separate energy consumer focus. But where our submission really is calling for is a review of all the market bodies and regulators, including the ECA, a review of their boards to ensure that consumer voice and investor voice is represented, because where we are and where we're moving to is definitely where we have been, and it's definitely not fit for purpose.
In fact, one of the earlier witnesses referred to your work in this space. I'm not sure if you heard that, but can I ask you about some of the work you've done on the importance of transmission investment? Are you able to elaborate on why investment in transmission is so important in our energy context?
Absolutely. I guess we have done quite a lot of analysis over the years, focusing on that question of, what is holding up the renewable investment or the replacement generation coming online to replace the coal power stations in a timely, orderly way. And the key answer keeps coming up as transmission. Transmission right now is holding up the investment in renewables and whether that's the existing grid and lack of capacity on the existing grid, or transmission that is needed in new areas where renewable projects can actually generate the wind and the solar that's needed. And we have done as well analysis on if we continue to delay the build out of transmission, because we've been talking about it for a very long time. And if I point to the committee, before the ISP, AEMO used to produce what was called the National Transmission Network Development Plan. And in those plans, AEMO basically had many of the transmission lines that are currently in the ISP. Things like the Western Renewables Link, VNI West, Project Energy Connect. These were all projects that were identified as needed in the system even before the ISP came about. We still have them in the planning, but we're not building them, or we're not building them fast enough. And one of the key issues is not only is our regulatory framework not fit for purpose, so the regulatory investment test that assesses the investment in transmission, the Power Energy Connect transmission project, which is quite significant to connect South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, took over 10 years for that transmission project to get approved through the pipeline and ongoing loops of the regulatory system. But more importantly, there's just no accountability on delivery. So we identify a project, but there is no one accountable to deliver these projects on time, and the dates just keep moving.
And what do you see the consequences in terms of price for consumers as the delay of the delayed investment in transmission?
It's higher electricity prices, and we've done modelling. We engaged with Endgame Economics to help do the modelling on the implications of the delays of transmission build out and the continuous push of these timelines, and the delays and implications are quite significant. I'll give you an example, and this is not just on the wholesale prices. On the wholesale prices, it is quite significant, especially in New South Wales and Victoria. But in New South Wales, for example, a 3-year delay in building transmission results in $1,092 increase on consumer bills, and these are households. Businesses are impacted a lot more. And right now, there is a minimum focus on business customers and the implication of delays to our businesses, whether they're small or large here in Australia.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ms Bashir, you talk about one of the things you refer to is lack of accountability in our market bodies for delays in planning, approvals, delivery, and they're all having an effect on our system, correct?
I would just slightly correct that, if I may. The accountability on actually delivering things on time, and it's not necessarily the market bodies per se, it is more accountable. There is no one right now accountable to deliver infrastructure in energy on time, and the transmission networks who are appointed to deliver these projects in the regulatory framework, they have no accountability for delivery on time.
Thank you. And this inquiry was set up to look at accountability right throughout our system. And with that lack of accountability, we're seeing delays, as you mentioned. We also see price increases as transmission projects get more and more expensive just due to, well, the stated reason is inflation over time, even though those timeframes are very, very short. So given all those things, we're still relying just on transmission to help with the transition, is there not cause, or would you believe that there are reasons to look at the way we plan the system in a more holistic way?
Yeah. So I don't think we need either or. We absolutely need to build the big stuff. And we need to invest in new transmission lines because we do need the replacement generation to be built and connected in a timely way, or we all pay for it. Mm-hmm. However, there are some medium and short-term solutions that can help accelerate and minimize the implications while we are building the big infrastructure. And I go back to my point earlier on energy storage. Utility scale storage is one of these solutions that can help reduce, alleviate some of the capacity issues on the existing transmission, to minimize curtailment of projects. We can also use energy storage.
Come back to that, because I've got some specific questions about storage as well. You talk about all of this is leading to, well, there's uncertainty about the closure of coal. Are all these delays due to the current processes we're using now, are they contributing to, in your mind, are they contributing to keeping coal in the system longer?
Yes, we're not building things fast enough. Absolutely. And so our solution is always to extend the date.
Yes.
Rather than think about, okay, well, we know whether it's, using the carbon budget as the timeline or the timeline that actually the owners of the coal power stations publish and report to AEMO. Either of these, we should be planning ahead of time and ensuring that we are shoring up investment in the replacement generation, coupled with the firming required to make sure that these dates are not extended and taxpayers are not paying unnecessary subsidies to keep those coal power stations open.
Thank you, I agree. So the fastest way to get rid of coal is more renewable generation, probably in the reses, and the documents behind the OSP point to a lot of proposed generation, or generation that's proposed to be built. So we then need transmission to get that into load centres, like from the rhombus of regret into Melbourne, get that energy into the system. But then, to your point, we also need storage or other non-network solutions, because the problem's not just network, is it?
No.
A large part of the problem that we're facing at the moment, and this is on the consumer side as well as on the large-scale side, is that given the enormous amount of generation that's happening in the middle of the day, we're seeing negative prices and lots of other distortions in the marketplace that just transmission alone won't solve. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So a better way to plan the system would be to look at all the solutions that might solve for the problem we've got, which is largely time of day, and being able to move load around, to be able to arbitrage that energy, to be able to provide FCAS services. Batteries have a real, well, not just an economic benefit. There are revenue. There's revenues that can be derived from batteries, isn't there?
That's correct. Yeah.
So batteries derive revenue and provide system services and benefits to the grid as a whole, that they can recover their own costs on a not on a cost recovery basis, on a revenue basis. So with batteries, you don't, it's a better way to grow the network or hasten the transition. Becomes better and faster and more economical if you're not just relying on a piece of infrastructure that relies on getting a guaranteed return from energy users. Is there, am I making or is there an economic argument there that should be made for a broader sense of how we plan the system?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in terms of, if we go back to the ISP, it does forecast quite significant amount of storage needed to come in. It's then, what are some of the mechanisms and tools to make sure we remove the barriers that exist for these projects to come online faster? We incentivize the right market, provide the right market signals and incentives, essential services, inertia, system strength, all of these things that really should be in place to value energy storage and the services they provide, just like other technologies in the system. I think these are the things that should be prioritised by the market bodies. There should be a direct focus on looking at what are some of the low-hanging fruit things that we need to create now that bring and shore up energy storage and services and value from energy storage into the system rather than focusing on other things.
100% agree, and thank you for that evidence. The transition away in the decarbonisation of the grid is really going to depend on this, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
And it's nearly 2025. All this transmission that AEMO's planned for, is still years off being built. Is Project Energy Connect even finished yet?
No, it's not. It's been delayed again. And, we've got VNI West that's due to come online. That's not shovel ready. We've got the Western Renewables Link that's stuck as well in the process, environmental processes and assessments as well. And so I think if we step back and think about what are some of the things that we're going to need, because we are in a infrastructure building for the nation, just like we did the first time when we did the centralised coal and the transmission build-out back in the day, we do need to have a similar approach where if we are serious about building this infrastructure, we are going to have to take a very different approach to how we build it and get it on time so that we're not, paying more than we have to.
Thank you for that. And, a key reason behind this inquiry is to hear evidence like that, because it's quite apparent, and we have lots of evidence now to show it, that the market bodies and the planning process and the approvals process isn't actually working at the moment and isn't delivering any of the things we need it to deliver. We have lots of people wanting to build renewable generation, can't get the product to market, and even if they could, they can probably only get a small proportion of it to market. What's normal capacity factor on from a solar farm? 30%.
Absolutely.
And then less network and economic constraint. It seems to me that our planning and how we look at this transition needs a fundamental shake-up and a review from economic first principles, not just least cost principles.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess social license is a really big one that we mentioned in our submission that goes to these same conversations. And, we do talk about that social license really starts in the home. When we are disincentivizing the uptake of solar and batteries, we continue to delay introducing the right incentives for people who are trying to do the right thing. It really doesn't build the trust needed so that when we are building the big stuff, there is a lot of, miscohesion, if you like, around that. And it's a really important conversation when we are talking about the transition.
Thank you. And would you agree that programs, when government, particularly Commonwealth government, that's never had a role in energy historically, and not even in the Constitution, at least electricity, Would you agree that when Commonwealth Government have to step in with programs, large programs such as Rewiring the Nation and the CIS, that they're signalling that the market or the system as we have it at the moment are failing?
I wouldn't say it's failing, but we do require a significant more investment than we've had in the past, and that has been quite necessary. It does provide a strong signal that, uncertainty for investment. Of course, there's going to have to be, over $140 billion invested in private capital to build this infrastructure, and that capital can't come into the country or with it and be invested here in this infrastructure without that certainty. And these policy signals from the federal government have been very important to do that.
I understand, and I think your point's correct. However, the ISP was designed to be able to clearly map out needs for and send signals for investment in the energy system and to assist the transition. But it's failed at that, hasn't it?
Well, it's not really supposed to be a policy roadmap. It is a...
No. I didn't say it was.
Yeah.
It's meant to map out
what's needed.
The
Correct.
needs, and then signal that they're then right for investment.
Yes. I mean, it's not helpful when we have to re-debate the scenarios. I mean, it's important that we have a roadmap that's not static, that is updated based on what's happening at the time and it incorporates development of government policy. But I think without the lack of bipartisan on the roadmap on which we need to go, it is very difficult for investors to find that certainty, and so you do need other mechanisms.
Thank you, and I trust and hope that the bipartisanship that this committee is showing towards this inquiry will result in a report with some findings and recommendations that might help assist with all of this. Thank you, Ms. Bashir.
Thank you.
If you were asked to take any questions on notice, then the committee has set out that Wednesday, 13 November is the due date for answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Recess for afternoon tea, and we will come back at 25, make it 20 to 4. Welcome back, and I now welcome representatives of HumeLink Alliance Incorporated and Regional Victoria Power Alliance. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For Hansard, will each of you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? Who would like to go first? Mr. Katz? You're on mute.
I can. Thank you. My name is Michael Katz. I'm a director of the HumeLink Alliance and have made a submission which goes to many of the issues affecting HumeLink in the future.
Thank you. Who's next? Ms. Strong?
Andrea Strong, President of HumeLink Alliance Incorporated.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson, is it?
Yes, thank you. My name is Vicky Johnson. I'm the chair of the Moorabool and Central Highlands Power Alliance, which is an incorporated group and that trades as the Regional Victoria Power Alliance. And our role is advocate for communities and landholders along two major transmission lines, Western Renewables Link and VNI West Interconnector, the Victorian length. So both those projects are in Western Victoria.
Thank you. And Wallaloo?
Hi, it's Marcia McIntyre and Cindy O'Sullivan. We're part of the executive team of the Wallaloo and Gree District Alliance Incorporated. We are... Yep. Okay.
Thank you. Do either of the groups, or does anyone have a short opening statement?
Yes, I do.
Ms. Johnson, you have the call.
A small one. I did provide you with a statement earlier today that I'm not too sure whether you would have had a chance to read. No. I might do a small one if that's okay.
Please.
Andrea, did you want to go first?
Yes, I had a statement.
Please.
Shall I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. The current system of energy planning and regulation is doing significant harm to the nation. It is both inefficient and inequitable. The objective of the national electricity market is to promote efficient investment in and efficient operation and use of electricity services. Efficient outcomes require the lowest cost electricity for the nation as a whole, taking into account all financial, environmental and social costs of options, the triple bottom line. In a major policy failure, transmission is planned in the national electricity market, ignoring environmental and social costs. The environmental and social costs are only considered at the end of the process when the project goes to government for planning approval. However, because these costs weren't considered early on in the planning process, the project option before government is often highly damaging to the environment, and the transmission network service provider then argues it's too late to build another option like underground transmission with better environmental outcomes. Prior to the federal election, Minister Chris Bowen stated that the regulatory investment test for transmission is not fit for purpose and not serving community interests, and vowed to fix it. The former Australian Energy Infrastructure Commissioner, Andrew Dyer, also said it's not fit for purpose. Excluding environmental and community costs from the cost-benefit analysis of transmission is why the regulatory system is not fit for purpose. This major flaw in transmission planning must be corrected. If environmental and social costs were taken into account, different energy market investments would be made. Instead of thousands of kilometres of overhead transmission lines, large water batteries remote from load centres like Snowy 2.0 and renewable energy projects dispersed geographically long distances from load centres, there would be underground transmission. more battery storage close to urban load centres, a concentration of renewables in regions where transmission infrastructure already exists, such as where coal-fired power stations are shutting down, offshore wind farms close to coastal urbanisation, and more rooftop solar. Governments overseas have come to the conclusion that when you take into account all the environmental costs of overhead transmission lines for the next 80 years, underground transmission is often the least cost option. Engineers are telling us that there have been major advances in underground cabling technology. It's entirely feasible, and the world is looking on in disbelief as Australia builds more overhead transmission lines. Amplitude Consultants has estimated the cost of undergrounding HumeLink to be 1.1 to 1.5 times the cost of the overhead option. The recently signed contract for the Marinus Link project confirms this to be a conservative estimate. There are significant benefits of undergrounding as follows. There's less impact on biodiversity as there's a smaller easement with undergrounding, and sections can be horizontal directional drilled or tunnelled. There's less risk of bushfires. Consultants Deloitte Access Economics estimated the cost of the 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires at $230 billion. You only need to stop one bushfire to pay for the extra cost of undergrounding. In July 2021, California announced it's burying 1,000 miles of overhead power lines to reduce the risk of wildfires at a cost of between 15 and 30 billion. When asked about the cost, the CEO said it's too expensive not to do it. Lives are on the line. Underground transmission also has less risk in severe weather. With global warming, severe weather is increasing, both in intensity and frequency. Recent blackouts in Broken Hill that were caused by severe weather will have big costs to businesses and consumers. There was also a major outage in Victoria in February 2024 caused by severe weather, where 620,000 homes and businesses lost power. The cost of the South Australia 2016 blackouts has been put at $367 million. There are other benefits of undergrounding transmission, such as there's no loss of visual amenity, no loss of noise amenity, no loss of the productive efficiency of agriculture, no loss of tourism, and no loss of regional development. In addition to the extensive environmental benefits of HVDC undergrounding, there are important operational benefits. There's less maintenance and there's less transmission losses. We need environmentally responsible transmission as well as generation as we transition to net zero. We can't put our solar farms and wind farms underground for less environmental and community impacts, but we can and should put transmission lines underground. We urge you to require a triple bottom line assessment when planning transmission projects. Give priority to underground cables as a principle in planning, and review the HumeLink project as an overhead line and require it to be delivered underground. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yes, if I may.
Briefly.
Michael Katz. I was going to talk at length about bushfires, but I have made a written submission which goes into some detail about that, so I'll not talk about that. But more directly to the terms of reference, I want to talk about the current regulatory regime, which is attempting to govern the transition from a coal-based energy system to one built around renewables and low-carbon emission technologies. It is totally unfit for purpose, as many people have said. When the system was established, transmission was treated as a national monopoly, and as such, transmission assets were treated as regulated assets. While this possibly made sense in the old environment, it doesn't make sense in a brave new world where we're attempting to redesign from scratch our electricity market. The investment in new assets under the current regime is a complex process. It is largely initiated by the development of the ISP, which you're well aware of. There are no costs associated or imposed on transmission network service providers like Transgrid who are proposing an overhead option with a high risk. Indeed, they are required to come up with the least cost alternative in terms of initial capital costs. They do not have to consider the losses, both direct and consequential losses, which come from strong winds, storms and bushfires. The example of Broken Hill, which is still without power as we speak as a result of only moderately high winds, destroying the overhead transmission line, servicing the whole region of Broken Hill, shows that the danger of a system which favours the development of overhead lines as opposed to fully costed long-term assets. Charging for transmission which is currently based on the regulated value of the assets, irrespective of usage, does not make sense. Asset owners receive a guaranteed return on their assets independently of usage. This, to my mind, is nonsense. The charges are funded, of course, by levies on consumers, and the critical point is that there are no price signals to inform and influence the allocation of capital to this activity. As such, this is a central planning or industrial policy approach at its worst. We urge the committee to recommend that urgent work be undertaken to explore other models of pricing of transmission assets. If we look at Spain and Canada, they have developed alternative models which may provide some guidance. We cannot expect central planners to efficiently allocate resources to the development of a resilient transmission grid in the absence of information from markets which reflect actual market behaviour. This is compounded by the emergence of what we have described as a regulatory industrial complex. This is the unfortunately over-close relationship which has emerged between various regulators and the transmission companies. This complexity of ownership and relationship is unfortunate and could lead, or possibly already has led, to extremely bad behaviour. We would like to see a change in the approach which would force regulators to take a more distant and arm's length approach to their servicing of the transmission companies. One approach which could be considered is to force the regulators to be funded by fines levied on the transmission companies. This would make them self-funded and would actually cause a great deal of distance to be established. However, the key point is that while this non-market-based approach to transmission is in place, we are not destined to have an efficient market-based solution to the development and change management of our electricity grid. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else, briefly, just so we've got time for the senators to ask questions? Yes, Ms Johnson. You're on mute, Ms Johnson.
My apologies. Thank you so much for the invitation to appear at this inquiry because, as you may be aware, our group did not do a submission to the inquiry, but I was invited to appear. As I said, I'm the chair of the Moorabool and Central Highlands Power Alliance, and we trade as the Regional Victoria Power Alliance. If I may give a really brief overview of our groups and our the way we've worked, would that be okay?
Very briefly, I know the senators have questions.
Sure.
If you're just going to put the structure, it might be better off just putting that on notice in writing.
Sure. Well, what I've done is as I said, I've this morning I provided the committee with a much longer statement, which goes into some detail about the toing and froing of these two projects, because as I said, there's Western Renewables link, which goes from the western outskirts of Melbourne all the way west to Bulgana, which is near Ararat, and then VNI West, or the Victorian section, which goes all the way northwards to the Murray River. So in that statement, as I said, there's a lot of detail, so I'd be grateful if the committee would accept that and publish it as RVPA's submission. And obviously if that statement raises further questions upon reading, I'm happy to be contacted at a later date. I'm hoping that isn't taking too much time and I can answer questions.
And very, very kind of you.
Just quickly, Vicky, we wanted to say we're from Wallaloo and Gree District Alliance. We represent a group of farmers and landowners, and we really wanted to we deal with AMO on the ground. We wanted to really share some of what we'd call horrendous experiences that we've lived in our community and inform you of what has led to what is hundreds of farmers locking AMO off their land and saying they will not deal with this organisation at all. They won't be getting our properties. VNI West will not be coming through this area. That's what we wanted to share. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. That's why this inquiry was set up. I might move to questions. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you all for being here today, giving up your time. I know you must be getting some fatigue from all of this, but it is important. Can I start where I think the speakers just left off, just on the consultation, the discussions you've had with any of the transmission planners that you've had to be involved in? Take us through what that process has been, and it sounds like there's been some frustration. So maybe if you could concentrate on what you think has been inadequate and what could be better, either going forward for you or in other areas.
Great. We would just like to say that our community has experienced what we've decided to call a search and destroy mission by AMO. They really, from the moment they stepped into our communities and couldn't answer our questions or had their microphones not working, and then they tried to put us into small groups so that we couldn't be with our friends and family. They've targeted widows and more vulnerable people in our community consistently. Grievances have been lodged around this. There's been false claims to police about community members assaulting or being abusive. And all this is documented extremely well. Lots has been reported, lodged as a complaint to AEMO, and then it's gone on to Andrew Dyer because it hasn't been actioned. And, yeah, I guess it's really just been, one, disappointing and completely shocking. And, yeah, everyone has had an experience they just couldn't believe would be part of their life and run by our own government. Did you want to add to that?
Well, sorry.
No, you're right. I'll just got some follow-ups to you before we go on to others, which we can do.
Sure.
But you pair, if you like, finish. Yep.
Okay. I suppose there's been a number of situations. So specifically, AEMO has released documentation saying that they have Section 93 powers, which gives them authority to enter our land, and also compulsory acquisition powers. And they said that in meetings, and they also put it in their landholder guides. That was later found to be they didn't have that, and I think they also said it on the radio. And they actually had to remove that from their documentation, which I know Vicky was also involved in. That's just one example. So I suppose, basically saying we have this power, we're going to do this. They didn't have the power. When that was pointed out, they then said we're applying for a licence and we expect to get that imminently. Also not true. They've just recently applied for it now, which we think is concerning, considering the only reason they want a licence is to coerce and bully to get onto people's land. And so I think it really clearly shows the kind of behaviour that we're facing. But as Cindy was saying, also there's been behaviour where there's like a young leader in the community has brought in like a stereo system so that the older people in the community can actually hear in the meetings, even though we don't get any answers. And they tried to take it off him, and then they actually, because they have security at all these meetings, and they actually put him on the ground. They actually physically handled him and took him down to the ground. And so, absolute, in our small rural communities, these things are shocking to see and to be part of, I suppose. And I think it's important that, that the politicians and everybody understands what these organisations are doing on the ground and how that's impacting us all. And, I suppose.
Thank you. Sorry, it's the chair here. Can I just ask a clarifying question? What licence was that you referred to that AEMO is applying for?
So in Victoria, and if I don't get it exactly correct, I'm sure Vicky will probably correct me on it, but you need to have it's called a Section 93 to actually to be able to force access onto people's land. And also, compulsory acquisition powers. So they were claiming to have that, and they actually put it in writing, and they also said it at meetings, but it wasn't actually. They didn't have that at all,
Thank you. I just want to get that on record. Senator Canavan, you have the call back.
Okay, thank you. I will come to others. So just a quick couple of follow-ups. Just so it's fresh in my mind, but I will give everybody an opportunity. You mentioned targeting of widows. What do you mean by that? How were they targeted, or why were they targeted? Is that for compulsory acquisition?
No, they don't have powers of compulsory acquisition. They would visit single women who live at home in the towns or on farms alone, and they had been requested by maybe the husband and the family that work in the farms not to go to those houses, to come and speak with them, and they would continue to go back to those houses of people that we consider are the most vulnerable.
So widows that live on their farms, K's out from town, sort of with no one else around them, they'd be visiting them and with a number of people, and they were quite...
It's extraordinarily intimidating. They asked that they would deal with them via email and not be on their property, and then they would come back.
They'd come anyway, even though they were asked not to.
People have now got cameras up, so now they can see what
people are frightened. It's frightened.
Right.
They are frightened.
I mean, that raises the issue of, do you think there needs to be any future elements of this needs to allow the proponent should have to help fund legal representation for people at these meetings? Like, if it's a lot for a widow to be sitting there having to deal with these issues without anybody on the other side there for them defending their rights?
Yes, they would say that they do provide some financial assistance for legal.
They do they?
If you want to pursue that line.
Okay.
But maybe they could follow their own procedures, and when grievances are made, take action and those staff be responsible for some of their behaviour.
I mean, I think there are laws about if someone's asked you not to come to your house. I believe there are laws about not coming to their house anyway. So I think there's kind of expected behaviour that these companies, these organisations, particularly one the size of our EMO, with the responsibility that holds, to be behaving in a specific way.
And the other one I just want to follow up with you is you said they isolate you in small groups. Did you have opportunities for town hall meetings and what have you, so everybody got to hear concerns?
No, they won't do that. They want to put you into small groups. They'll talk to 3 or 4 at once, which is completely unsatisfactory because there's certainly some people that are not competent enough to speak. It's hard to understand how to get your questions articulated, and it's just not acceptable. So certainly meetings have been closed. They've walked. There's been major problems.
Well, that's just an old tactic to divide you all and also avoid you actually sharing concerns you might have and convincing others.
And understanding that other people have concerns as well that are similar.
That's right. Yeah. Okay, let's travesty. Sorry about that. I know I might use all my time on this chair, but that's okay. I'll go to others now. I think Ms Johnson, you had some points to make. Over to you.
Thank you, Senator. I just wanted to follow through with what Marcia and Cindy said. The licence that they were talking about is a transmission licence. So it's to actually allow the company, or it says that the company will transmit electricity, but it gives them other authority under the Electricity Industry Act, and that's that Section 93. Along the line, so Marcia and Cindy, Marcia is actually on our RVPA steering committee that I'm chair of. We are strongly allied, and I can speak, though, to many of the Western Renewable Link experiences, which has involved AusNet. AusNet is the project contractor for Western Renewables Link. In the case of Western Renewables Link, we didn't even know that the project existed until a year after the RIT was completed and 6 months after AusNet was contracted. So there was utterly no engagement whatsoever. The Western Renewables RIT started in 2017. We've had it landed on us as well. And unfortunately, that was in COVID times. So it was extremely stressful. There's been not a single town hall meeting. There's been a lot of webinars. There's been a lot of drop-in sessions that people have found extremely satisfactory because they were getting different answers to their neighbours, entirely different answers to their neighbours. We didn't even have experts at the meetings. And as it went on, as the engagement and consultation became more and more fraught over the years, meetings were cancelled because AusNet felt that they were being threatened, which they weren't. They were the ones who always had security there. And they even have security now in trying to access people's land. They do have a transmission licence, so they do have that Section 93 ability. But there are plenty of stories of them knocking over a man in the early days, trying to move his pregnant mares because they'd already jumped the fence. That was actually filmed and appeared on A Current Affair early in the years. We've been fighting Western Renewables Link for 4.5 years now, and Marcia and Cindy have been fighting VNOS for 1.5, and we've been combined fighting for 1.5. So the examples that both of us all three of us could give, could literally take an entire day to give the examples of the entirely poor treatment that communities, the misinformation, the deception that we've all suffered.
Thank you. And maybe Mr. Katz next. Did you want anything about consultation? Add anything?
Well, I would support the previous speakers in saying that Transgrid's consultation has been very nearly appalling, if not worse than that. They, in particular, offered all of us along the HumeLink line an option agreement which had a ridiculous structure. It provided 110% of everything that Transgrid would require early on in the process against a $20,000 payment, which in the context of what they were trying to do was can only be described as chicken feed. And it was enough to get some of the very small landholders, I think, to accept it, because for them it was a realistic amount. But for the larger landholders who understood what it was, that this was absolutely outside the gamut of what should be allowed, because at no stage has Transgrid had anything other than a very small opportunity to compulsorily acquire the actual easement for the line, whereas the option gave them the opportunity to use, without acquiring, anything they wanted to, basically. And so I thought the structure of their proposal from the very beginning was outrageous.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Strong.
Yes, I think the community engagement review undertaken by Andrew Dyer speaks to the incredible failures of engagement. 92% of respondents were dissatisfied with engagement. Damning. In addition, something a little bit more specific to HumeLink. In early 2023, Transgrid said in a community consultative group meeting that they were going to contact the 4,322 indirectly impacted landowners. Now, they had mentioned contacting those landowners back in 2021. We said, if you're going to contact them, we would like to see the brochures you're going to send, because the early contact with landowners that were directly impacted had no images of what they were actually building in the first brochure, and later brochures not showing the actual towers, showing towers of a smaller transmission line. So it had been raised in 2021. We're up to 2023. These indirectly impacted landowners Now, they're going to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially in the value of their property. Because they're indirectly impacted, they'll receive no compensation. They're likely to be strongly opposed to the transmission line. Transgrid in early 23 said they were going to directly contact those people, door knock them. Well, landowners in the district went out and did door knock those landowners, and in early 2024, most of them knew nothing of the project. And so this is a major, major failure of Transgrid's consultation. And when they were, so that's 2024, the environmental impact statement submissions closed on the 10th of October 2023. So they had no opportunity for input to ensure that the best route was selected that minimised impacts. Yes, very disappointing.
Look, thank you. Chair, I had more questions, but I think it was important to let people disclose those experiences. Thank you. Thank you all.
Senator Gosh.
Thank you, Chair, and may I say thank you to the witnesses for appearing today and giving evidence. In terms of the evidence you've given, some of that's quite distressing, but in terms of what you would want to see in terms of consultation and engagement on these projects, what are the sorts of things that are going to be effective and are going to alleviate some of these concerns? Putting aside the bad behaviour, what are the consultation and engagement mechanisms that you think you would want to see are going to be effective?
So you can talk to this. Yeah. Okay. Just one thing. Yeah. Look, I just want to say, you know, I think that this whole thing falls down right at the beginning because agriculture and regional communities are not considered at all. The importance of agriculture itself, the importance of food production, the importance of the communities that do that are not considered. They're not mentioned anywhere. They're not even considered stakeholders. You know, they are just basically, it's an afterthought when they get on the ground. And I think if agriculture and as an entirety was actually considered in the way that it should be and the importance that it should have, then we wouldn't be facing this issue, because the way this would be happening would be to minimise these impacts straight up. And something like V&O West, for example, which is a completely unnecessary transmission line, which is only going to allow three wind factories onto it, you know, for the cost of it, the whole project is an absolute farce. And the amount of damage that it's going to be done to the community and to agricultural land, biodiversity, because of a ridiculous project. It wouldn't be happening if agriculture and our food production was considered in the way that it should be. And I suppose in Victoria, it's really apparent where the Victorian government actually wrote a report, the Victorian, it was Offshore Winds Direction paper in 2022, where they stated that up to 70% of all Victorian agricultural land will be required for wind and solar. I mean, that in itself kind of shows the complete ignorance and complete lack of understanding about our food, the importance of our food, and it should be in terms of, you know, government, our own sovereignty, our own security. Like COVID should have taught us that we need to be protecting very, very carefully our very precious and, to be honest, and very limited. We have a very small amount of agricultural land that compared to other nations, that is actually of productive, viable, productive agricultural land, and we should be protecting that as our number one, you know, most special thing that we hold. Yeah. And I think if that was happening, then none of this, we wouldn't be facing any of this rubbish. Food security becomes before energy security, and this is not, it's not even being considered. And every time it's brought up, it's just like pushed to the background. Like, we've been to a number of these things and it's never considered. And when it's brought up, it's like, oh, it will sort it out when we get to the end somehow.
When we've got no food left.
And
I also wanted to just very quickly say that the Paris Agreement, which is behind all of this, actually states that we need, as part of that, which is, I won't go on, we need to, in a manner that does not threaten food production. And that is not nowhere in all of the policy is that actually being adhered to. So I think that's just, I just wanted to add that in. Thank you.
I think the other thing I would add to that, if I may, is that the consultation which takes place is largely irrelevant anyway, because as soon as a serious objection is raised, you fall back on the problem that all of these decisions are governed by the regulatory infrastructure, which consists of ISP followed by RIT-T followed by all this word salad of acronyms.
Yeah.
And those do not add up to a proper system of developing long-term assets to change the way we deliver energy. And that's why your committee, I think, has a duty to reinvestigate the very fundamentals of the regulatory process, to actually start charging for transmission instead of treating it as a sunk cost, to actually look at things properly from a market perspective and from an environmental perspective, and to look at things in that way rather than the current way, which is set up with so much complexity that people like us, even with some experience, find it incredibly difficult to navigate this amazing web of organisations and sub-organisations with almost unlimited budgets to throw lawyers at us and any other objectors.
And if I could just have some input to this discussion on consultation. The consultation isn't going to result in what needs to happen. What needs to happen is the rules need to be changed so that these, so AEMO in developing the integrated system plan and transmission network service providers, when they're looking at different options, when they're comparing an overhead option to an underground option, are required to take into account all the costs. They need to do that. So then they will look at the least cost option for the nation as a whole. And they'll take into account the costs of bushfires. They'll take into account the costs of severe weather. They'll take into account the costs of loss in biodiversity and the loss in visual amenity, the loss of our landscapes of great natural beauty. It's critically important that, first of all, they're assessing these things on a triple bottom line. The consultation, you talk to them about the fact that they're not coming up with the least cost overall option, and they say, well, the rules don't require us to take into account those costs, and therefore they dismiss the option. It's critically important that those costs are taken into account, and we get the option that's least cost overall for the nation, which will often be the underground option.
Thank you, Chair. No, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I ceded my time to my colleagues here, so I won't put any questions today. I might have some on notice. I would, however, like to acknowledge the very good work of Commissioner Dyer, who many of you mentioned before, and thank him for his work. And I'm sure the new Commissioner will continue to do an outstanding job, and I look forward to putting some questions to him in estimates next week. Thank you all for appearing. If there are any other statements that or submissions you wish to make, please do. Any questions that you ask to take on notice, if they could also be provided by Wednesday, 13 November 2024. Thank you. Thank you for appearing. Now I call Dr. David Carland. Dr. Cullen, for Hansard, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
My name is David Carland. I'm Executive Director of Australian Resources Development Proprietary Limited.
Thank you. Would you like to make a short opening statement?
Yes, briefly, Chair. Thanks for the opportunity. I've been writing in this area for several years, and sometimes you're not sure where this is getting, but I've kept at it. My sort of approach to this was to try and take a higher level look at the ISP and what it was actually doing. It says it's a plan, but it actually describes itself as an optimal pathway, not a plan, a pathway, and we might come back to that because I think it's quite important, especially some of the things said earlier about planning. My first major issue is under the National Electricity Objective. The ISP is required to make sure renewable energy targets are met in terms of essentially carbon dioxide emissions. The ISP assumes that this can only be met by firmed renewables. No other option is looked at. There's I think about 10 little buttons here you can tick in the spreadsheets, but you can go to counterfactual and you see all the coal plants shutting it all the time, no other form of technology, just various levels of intensity of batteries versus storage versus generation, etc. And in particular, there's no analysis of the nuclear option, which is another way of getting to low emissions. The reason it's not analysed, and it's directly said by AEMO, that technology is banned. Now, I think this is a highly disingenuous statement. Because a particular technology is banned doesn't stop us from analysing it. It hasn't stopped another committee analysing it here. It hasn't stopped the CSIRO analysing it here. It hasn't stopped AUKUS in the investigation of nuclear submarines. So I think that's a very sort of limp reason not to investigate nuclear. Second, and I think this comes to this pathway versus plan, the ISP does not produce realistic projections. It seems to develop this optimal plan with a load calling for various generation investments and closures and gas and backup to meet reliability. And it has a very strong growth in wind and solar and batteries, coal plant shutting. AEMO has another publication, the Electricity Statement of Opportunities, which comes out about 2 months later. And that's focused on reliability, not about optimising, not about growth, not about path. And they look out 10 years. And by 2031, the 10th year for the latest, I looked at the 2031 as the last year I looked at, the difference in gigawatts in the system was 30 gigawatts. ISP says 100 would be built in operation. ESO says 70. And where that difference is, big, the ESO looks at anticipated and committed projects, not optimising anything. That's what they really look at doing. The wind projects aren't coming forward at the rate of being sort of through the optimal path, and perhaps what I've just listened to may be a reason. The battery aren't developing, or anticipated and committed aren't developing. And the irony is the only reason we've got 70 megawatts is a Raring State Open. And I think we'll come back to that on dealing with risk. My third thing is the ISP significantly underestimates the cost of all this. We are told that the step change scenario cost is 122 billion, of which 16 billion is transmission. I've gone through and I've done in my paper in detail a brief statement. That excludes the non-capital costs of the existing plant. It excludes the cost of the existing generation assets, transmission and distribution assets. It excludes, and the one that I think is quite worrying, is it includes the cost of investment in the distribution network. As the ISP goes forward, and heard earlier today, it's relying on this CER, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on the distribution network, backflowing increasing scale and associated cost. The ISP says it relies on this to deliver the plan or as part of the plan, but it will pay for, I think it says something like it will be paid for in another way, completely excluded from the cost. And the last thing is the cost of the subsidies for these schemes. And when all these costs are included, I had a back of the envelope pop at this, and I think it could be 0.6 of $1 trillion. And if someone doesn't like that number, I invite them to tell me what the right number is. And I think someone asked a very relevant question. No one's investigated the distribution and how much this is going to cost. And it's very difficult to put a handle on it. But what I do know is the regulated asset base of the distribution network is nearly 4 times that of transmission. The claim, and I think this has kind of been settled, but throughout the ISP, reference is made to affordable electricity. And if you actually work your way through it, it confuses lower cost electricity with affordable electricity. And I've got a chart in my submission showing the significant rise in real electricity prices over the last couple of decades. So lower cost doesn't mean affordable. And if AEMO wishes to sustain this claim, it'll need to explain why federal and state governments feel the need to subsidise electricity for retailers. Why would you do that if it's affordable? And secondly, that chart I talked about, if it's affordable, what was it 5 years ago? Really, really affordable? So the increase in price. And finally, we're continually hearing it, renewables are the lowest cost. Well, I go back to my point about the never investigating nuclear. If the only thing you investigate is renewables, you've got no basis for that statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Canavan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Look, it's a very useful submission, Dr. Carland, so thank you for that. I just wanted to explore the point you made about the difference between the ISP and the ESOO. You have a chart on your submission at page 8, which compares the projected energy sources in the next 7-8 years between the ISP and the ESOO. There are stark differences. Can you just explain a bit? The ESOO, we kind of know what the ISP did from last week's hearing on how they get to those numbers with carbon budgets and other carbon climate policies.
Sorry, that's the ESOO.
Sorry, the ISP. The ISP.
The ISP is
the government policies.
Optimal plan. The world goes forward.
So we kind of know that. How do they determine the ESOO then? What do they do to determine what's there?
It's a little bit opaque, but anticipated and committed projects only.
Okay.
And I think what's actually happening, and I think this is most exposed in the transmission, the ISP, and particularly the generation side, the capacity, they're just assuming, well, its model works like, well, we've got a load of umpteen terawatt hours this year. We're heading towards net zero. We've got to meet that condition. We will have to put all this plant in. We'll have to put these batteries in.
Right.
And when in ESO they go and actually look, and it's more akin to planning. I mean, you start planning from a point of reality. And with planning, you can generally have a business plan. I've got a finance background as well as energy. And one would sit down and have a good look at where the next couple of years are going to go before you sort of kick off your sort of optimised plan. So I think that's, and I'm again happy to be corrected if AEMO can tell me that I'm not comparing like with like, and I suspect I mightn't be, but that's the point. The ESO people are very focused on it because of reliability gaps that are opening up at a time when you look at the ISP, it's saying the world is lovely, it's all reliable, it's all lower cost.
Is it fair to say then the ISP kind of just assumes it can open, it just assumes that these things will happen
I'm not sure
rather than actually look at the reality of whether they can happen?
Yeah. It has a series of costs, the model, it's a series of costs, it optimises it, minimises the cost.
Yep.
But it's never asked the question, can the transmission line be built, HumeLink? That doesn't come into it. Whether as ESO, they are looking at that thing. They are looking seriously at what is coming in the near term.
Just going to the price impact here, there was nothing I found underwhelming last week. The look at prices, you've got a chart on in Appendix 3 of your submission shows the incredible rise in Australian consumer prices. What do you put it down to? Why are our prices so high now relative to some other comparable countries?
I've got another chart, Senator Canavan, but I actually put the real prices on. They're just nominal prices, and I've pointed out a few bumps. If you compare the real price of retail electricity to the share of generation from renewables, there is an uncanny correlation. I'm an econometrician by trade, and I understand correlation is not causation. But again, I put the onus back on, is this just, by happenstance, that as we've pushed more and more renewables into the system, the retail cost of electricity, and a very obvious answer, the bill stack, the thing of sticking in the green taxes into the bill for a start must be directly related, transmission, etc.
Well, maybe on notice, could you provide us that chart? I've probably seen it before, but it just might be useful for the committee to have.
Straight out of catalogue 6401.
Okay, great. How would you change the ISP then? What do you think needs to change to provide a more realistic projection?
I think they need a plan, and I think Senator Van was saying something earlier in the day. So, financing. The starting point for a sound financing plan is a risk matrix and risk allocation. Sit down, look at all the potential risks you're facing, look at the consequences of those risks, and look at the ways you might mitigate it. This instance, compare the ISP with ESO as we've just been doing. What could we do if the wind capacity development doesn't come, or the batteries? What could we do? There's nothing in it. There's no fallback. There's no plan B. I think it's quite ironic. The default plan B is leave the coal plants open. And so if you would really seriously look at the ISP and say, so what's your mitigating factor? It looks like it's to leave the coal plants open.
And they're getting older and harder to maintain or invest in.
Well, they're getting older. I've been involved, as you know, in buying old power plants in Queensland, whatever. It's not so much the old issues. It's grandfather's axe and a lot of it. There are creep life issues, that there is an end of life. But the dispatch regime, and I was watching it last week, watching that explained. We were backing all these people off. I looked half an hour ago, there were negative prices all over the place.
Right.
Tonight at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, they'll be $200-300.
Yeah.
That's because the coal plants are keeping going, and they're keeping pressure up in their boilers, and a lot of them haven't got generator steam bypass, so that's costing them significant money to keep the pressure up, to be there to gain the benefit of supplying the load. So I think there are two issues to be looked at, and for years I've been saying this, that we need to have some mechanism that allows the coal generators to run at min-gen levels. And this massive amount of rooftop solar pouring into the market, as an economist would say, it's worthless. It's got a negative value. It's actually kind of...
We're having to tax people now,
it's like a Swiss bank account. You actually had to pay a negative interest for the security of keeping your money there. That's how they sorted that out. So reducing all this power that no one wants...
Maybe just get you to expand on that from the evidence last week. It seemed to me that we've got this situation, we're already starting to impose taxes now on solar exports to the grid because of the excess solar. The government's got a capacity investment scheme which will encourage more grid-scale solar, but potentially encourage that. Won't that just exacerbate this?
Yeah, absolutely. The only reason we've got so far with renewables is because we had some excess capacity in some older coal plants. And I know intimately the Gladstone station, and it can go from 280 to 100 times 6. So during the day, there's a lot of megawatts sitting in there. It's been able to come up and take the load. If you force those coal plants off with more, so if you keep pushing renewables into Queensland, Gladstone won't be able to keep going during the day. They'll go to a 4-unit operation or 2. I think they're already on low units over weekends and stuff. You won't be able to keep the lights on. And I know the solution. We'll have the Victorian Mornington Peninsula solution, or the Adelaide Oval solution. You'll have gen sets sitting on the back of trucks, connected to an oil tanker, to make sure we don't have outages. So it comes to a point, and that someone really needs to sit down with a real plan of how this is going to work.
Okay.
Or sort of a realistic plan.
Just finally from me then, Chair, just You do mention nuclear in your submission as well. Is that another thing you think the ISP should look at? Should it look at, at least look at the cost and possibility of
it should look
nuclear?
at all technologies and not look at a particular one because it's banned. I mean, you know, is offshore wind fully approved and whatever? Doesn't stop them from looking at it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Hydrogen too, for example.
Look at that. Look at it. I'm quite
of
agnostic on this. I just think we should have the lowest cost here. But I can't have people saying I don't agree. Sorry, that renewables they can say that renewables are the lowest cost way of delivering a low emission outcome.
Yeah.
Until they look at nuclear, and let's have the big debate about is how much per kilowatt is it, and etc. and safety and whatever.
All right. Thank you, Chair. I'd have more, but I realise there's time.
I'll just check with Senator Grogan, who's joined us in place of Senator Gosh. Okay. Senator Grogan, do you have questions? Senator Grogan?
Can you hear me?
I can now. Thank you.
Yes,
welcome.
I'm terribly sorry. I'm in the car, so please excuse the quality of the sound. Dr. Garland, thank you so much for coming in this afternoon. I really appreciate it. Can I just start? I'm interested in your perspective on nuclear energy. The AER chair and a number of other experts, both in this inquiry but also in the other nuclear inquiry that's also running at the same time, have said that that the timeframes may not line up, so that nuclear is too slow to really play a role in replacing coal as it's currently structured to exit, which, as we know, is a decision made by the coal plants. What's your view on the potential role of nuclear power, and would that really require the coal to be extended? So would we have to look at extending those coal plants?
Thank you. I always make a joke at this stage. My name is Carland, and it wasn't my grandmother who wrote the books, but no one gets that joke right. Look, two things. Thank you. My view is put the nuclear into the planning framework, put realistic assumptions in there. I heard yesterday 11 years. OK, put that in, put its cost in, and look how that can be fitted in together with, or compare it with renewables. Because part of my discussion to date is, I guess, leading to the point I don't think renewables are going to fill the hole either. Or put it this way, they're clearly, by observation, not filling the hole at the moment. We've kept Eraring open, your lawn's going to stay open, and my gut feel is we're going to have to keep them going for a hell of a lot longer until either renewables do the job or nuclear does the job, or some combination thereof, which gives us the least cost outcome. So I totally accept, the nuclear group were here yesterday, perhaps in the other, how do you say it, another meeting. And if it's 11 years, it's 11 years. The old, what's the best time to plant a tree? 11 years ago. If you didn't plant 11 years ago, what's the best time to plant a tree? Plant the tree now. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not a nuclear advocate by any means. I'm certainly, and I'm not, I don't think meeting emissions targets is a bad thing, or it's a worthwhile thing. That's fine. I just think we should take a realistic view of how we're going to get there.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So I did note, and I may have heard you wrong, that you said you were buying coal plants in Queensland?
Oh, years ago, in part of my career, we bought the Gladstone Power Station. It was quite an old power station, but just a point of fact, we did major engineering studies of its life. We bought it in 1994. It's in the public domain. Its contracts run until 2029, and my mates around the place still say it's running quite okay. Its biggest issue was getting on the system. It's not got mine mouth coal. So it's, in a sort of marginal cost sort of basis, it's pretty high. And it, I think, has trouble staying on when there's huge amount and growing amounts of particularly PV power is in the system. So that's my experience with that.
Great, thank you. So if we were to look at nuclear, how much capacity do you think is required in the system? We know that the policy being put forward by the coalition is seven sites. How much nuclear capacity do you think we would need?
Yeah. In some sense, it's like mathematics. You tell me its capacity factor, how much it produces. If you're going to back it off during the day and bring it through in the night, which nuclear power actually works quite well because its fuel cost is quite low once you've bought it. It'll tell you in a sense how sort of many you need. But again, I think that's a number that the AEMO technical people, modelling people, should be able to do relatively easy. My bigger issue is and I think this is what needs to come out, and all the stuff we just talked about. We won't need the transmission lines from the reses, and we won't need this growth in their distribution network to the extent with which we're now talking about. So, at the wholesale level, the numbers will be what the numbers, but let's say they're more expensive than firmed energy, but it's almost, a matter to be worked out. But certainly the distribution and transmission costs will be much lower if we build on existing sites.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that the site's total is around 11 gigawatts, I think, which is about 4% of the capacity that we'll need by 2050, according to my AEMO. So what would you see as that nuclear plant distribution around Australia to make up what we would need?
Sorry, the 11 gigawatts are 11 gigawatts of what? What technology? Sorry, I didn't hear.
I think it's the coal capacity for the nuclear part. So that's what would go in. So we would be effectively the 11 gigawatts of the 7 sites is what I believe it is, would equate to 4% of that capacity that we're going to have in 2050. So that would be the coal capacity we have now, but also the increase in demand that we would be expecting.
Load growth, sure, yeah, but the benefit of putting them on existing sites is the transmission networks are thick and they're there. We don't have any social licence issues. What you may be alluding to, we may.
Sorry, my point was how much would we need? Because 7 wouldn't do it. I wouldn't have thought. But my expertise is not in how big you can make a nuclear power plant.
Well, my answer, okay, I understand. What I'd say, and it's not a question I'm going to answer here, I'm happy to go away and think about it if you want to, but you're going to have to to tell me the capacity factor of those units. Because if I'm going to run them at 50%, I'll have to double the amount. And obviously the dollars a kilowatt hour are going to double.
To be perfectly honest, I don't think anyone's modelled that, so I'm not sure. So I might kind of go away and have a think about that and scope that up into a question
let's
on notice, if that's all right.
That's fine.
Chair, I think the issue is, Senator Grogan, you need to adjust the capacity, adjust the AEMO figures for the capacity factor of solar and wind. So it's not directly comparable to nuclear. When you say 4% of capacity, if nuclear is running at 90% and solar at 20% and wind at 30%, it's just quite hard to compare them. It's not they're not apples for apples.
And that's why, Senator.
Thank you very much.
You need to do a system analysis.
Yeah.
That running in the system, something else running in the system. What's the total system cost?
Yes, indeed. So what I'm trying to get to, without unpacking it to a highly technical scenario, is that how much would we need? So let me take that away and bring it to you on notice, just to save us. I know we're short on time. So
happy to respond.
Thank you. So I just wanted to touch on the inclusion of emissions reduction alongside the issues of affordability and reliability in the national energy objectives. What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, AEMO has been doing this for several plans. Previously, it used to say, we've put in the assumption that we'll meet government emission targets because we think it's in the best interest of the community. So AEMO has had a view on it all along. Putting them in, my issue with putting them in is policies are transient. The Labor Party in 2019 took a 43% reduction to the 2019 election. At the next election, it's 82%, and then that morphs into net zero 2050. And no one's got clean hands. The Liberals, I think November 21, before the Glasgow thing, the Liberal National Party came out with a plan for net zero 2050, which had nearly as absurd projections of how rich we're going to be in the future. So I think that's probably my issue, Senator, that in 3 years' time, and it actually make it very difficult for AEMO, they could be chasing their tails. You know, it's all the state government plans as well as the federal plan, and these targets could change. So they've got to now rework the whole thing. That's my problem with that. Whereas cost minimisation is pretty universal. It's not going to change.
But the issue of emissions reductions in terms of recognising it in the national energy objective, regardless of sort of your interpretation of Labor policy or whatever, emissions reduction is, well, let me ask you the question as opposed to say, would you say that emissions reduction is something that is an international focus, that there's many countries, particularly countries that we trade with, who are very keen and dedicated to emissions reduction? Mm-hmm. Would you disagree with that?
No, that's a societal decision. Everything I've written, I've said that. It's not that I've got any objection to low emissions outcomes. I say it's not a bad thing, and I say it's worthwhile. My issue is you should tell people the cost. That's all. Because I think I heard, turning over, the people of a goodwill, they want to do the right thing, and they've been told that renewables are lower cost. And that's my challenge to that. I've got no view. It is society's view. It's their call. Net zero 2050 has bipartisan support in this country, so no question of that.
Okay, so sort of building on that, like as you say, the 2050 target is an agreed bipartisan scenario. Would you also agree that the burning of fossil fuels is the primary driver of dangerous climate change? And from that, as a result, there is an imperative to move away from fossil fuel generation? I'm
not going to answer those sort of questions, thanks. I wrote a submission about the ISP.
Okay.
You've walked me into now. You want to entangle me in some sort of environmental thing. I'm not interested. I've tried to look at the figures. I've made my point about cost. I've made my point about agreeing with the current policies. I'll leave it at that, thanks.
Oh, Dr. Garland, I'm sorry if I've offended you in any way. It certainly wasn't my
inoffendable, Senator.
intention.
I'm an ex-investment banker. I am totally inoffendable, and my name is Carland. Thank you.
That's what I said, Carland.
Oh, okay.
I've got it right here in front of me.
Okay.
I do try and get people's names right, and I do try not to offend. So my apologies.
You were
Dr.
safe
Carland.
with me. Thank you.
Thank you.
You done, Senator Grogan?
Yes, thank you, Chair, I am. Thank you.
Senator Canavan, you've
got one more. It says time. You mentioned nuclear should be included, etc. What about coal? Should we look at investing in new coal-fired power stations? At least look at the cost.
Well, that's almost the same question. I came here under the ISP, and under the ISP, the national electricity objective is meet emissions targets. So in that environment, go ahead and building new coal plants is not within, if you like, the remit of AEMO. Would it be a cheaper outcome? Would it be it's something we go away and test, but it'll certainly blow the emissions.
Yeah. I thought I heard
my issue on coal is.
I thought I heard you mention though it's useful to look at a lowest cost scenario. I mean, do you think it's useful? What I'm saying is, I'm not saying.
No, I did that 2 submissions ago, and I got pilloried in the Guardian for being someone who suggested a coal-only scenario. And I think, with all due respect, where that was heading, and people go and Google me, and they come up with that.
I still think I'm beating you, Dr. Cowan.
That was a completely different context. But in a sense, as an for instance, what carbon tax do we need?
Yeah.
And the way you would go set the carbon tax is to run the coal-only scenario and look what taxes you need to put in place to
get... Well, it won't even tell us the shadow carbon price. I don't know if you followed that.
Oh, I know.
AEMO won't even reveal to us.
I understand that, but I'm just saying
the shadow carbon price.
The rational way to do it is run the coal-only scenario, and that tells you the cost of doing anything.
Yeah.
And again, Senator, it might be perfectly fine and acceptable. The community wants that. Perfect.
Yeah, but it would be useful at least to know the cost of.
Well, that's my point. I think people aren't being told. They've been told renewables are lower costs. And so and people are of goodwill, and they've been put in a world where not only it's doing the right thing for the environment, it's cheap. And I think that's my graph, and that's all sort of falling apart.
Yeah, I think people are waking up to it.
So don't accuse me of heaven.
I certainly can't accuse someone of being too pro-coal. I think that might not fly. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cullen. I don't have any questions other than to recognise the work you did in your submission. Is excellent looking at the economics of the ISP, etc. So thank you for appearing
Thanks
today.
very much. Appreciate it, Chancellor.
And thank you to the Secretariat and Hansard for looking after us today. And we will be back tomorrow morning. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.